The worst part about being humiliated in front of everyone is not what they say, it is how quickly everyone else decides it must be true. My name is Emma Walker, and I never expected a simple family gathering in a quiet suburban home in Ohio to become the moment that quietly split my life into before and after. It started like most family events do, with polite smiles, controlled conversations, and the kind of background noise that pretends everything is normal even when it is not. My brother, David Walker, had invited several relatives and close friends to his home that afternoon, introducing it as a casual celebration with his fiancée, Olivia Bennett, present for the first time with the extended family. From the outside, it looked warm and ordinary, but from the moment I stepped inside, I could feel the familiar pattern I had learned to recognize over the years, the subtle way conversations shifted when I entered a room, the brief pauses that lasted just a little too long, the polite acknowledgement that carried no real weight. He took a seat near the edge of the living room, the place people choose for someone they are not sure how to include, and tried to remain invisible in a space that still required my physical presence. David was already in the center of the room, talking confidently, laughing easily, moving through conversations as if the entire space naturally belonged to him. It was a version of him I had seen many times, but something about that day felt sharper, as if he was performing for an audience he wanted to impress more than usual. Olivia stood nearby, observing quietly, her attention moving between people with careful curiosity rather than automatic acceptance. I noticed that she did not interrupt, did not immediately align herself with Anjoni's opinion, and that alone made her presence feel different from the rest of the room. For a while, I said very little, responding only when spoken to directly, answering questions in short phrases that did not invite further attention. It was easier that way, or at least it had been in the past. But something about the atmosphere that day felt unstable, like a conversation balancing on the edge of something that had not yet named. The turning point came during what seemed like an ordinary exchange, when someone asked about family updates and future plans. David laughed lightly, then shifted his tone in a way that changed the energy in the room without anyone immediately noticing. He looked at me and made a comment that framed me as unnecessary, describing me in a dismissive way that caused a ripple of uncomfortable silence among those listening. It was not loud or aggressive in the traditional sense, but it was precise, deliberate, and socially positioned in a way that made it difficult for anyone to respond without disrupting the group dynamic. I remember feeling the room adjust around me, not because of what I said, but because of what I did not say in return. A few people smiled awkwardly, others looked away, and no one corrected him. That silence was heavier than the comment itself, because it confirmed how quickly perception can become accepted when no one challenges it. In that moment, I understood that humiliation does not always need volume, it only needs agreement through inaction. And just as I was beginning to process that shift, I noticed Olivia looking directly at me for the first time with a kind of focus that did not match the rest of the room. She did not react with laughter or discomfort like the others. Instead, her expression suggested something closer to confusion, as if the version of me being presented did not align with what she was observing. That was the moment she leaned slightly forward and asked, in a calm but deliberate tone, a question that changed the entire direction of the room. She asked who I actually was. And in that single question, everything that had been assumed about me in the last few minutes suddenly became uncertain. The moment Olivia asked who I actually was, the atmosphere in the room did not immediately change outwardly, but something subtle shifted in the way people were paying attention. It was no longer just a background gathering where conversations flowed around me as if I were optional. Now there was a pause that did not belong to me alone, but to everyone who had just witnessed what had been said and left unchallenged. I remember turning slightly toward her, not because I was surprised by the question itself, but because it was the first time anyone in that room had expressed doubt about the version of me that had just been casually constructed by my brother. David gave a short laugh at first, as if the question itself was unnecessary, and he began to respond in a dismissive tone that suggested he was about to reinforce the same narrative he had just used. But Olivia did not react to him. Her attention remained on me, steady and focused, as if she was comparing what she was hearing with what she was observing. That difference alone was enough to make the room feel less certain. He did not answer immediately, not because I did not know what to say, but because I was aware that anything I said would now be filtered through the assumption that it had already created. In situations like this, words do not always function as correction. Sometimes they function as permission for others to continue believing what is easiest. He chose to remain quiet for a moment longer, allowing the discomfort in the room to expand naturally without interference. That silence made David slightly more impatient, and he repeated part of his earlier statement, this time adding a tone of emphasis that suggested he expected agreement from the others present. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one corrected him. It was the same pattern as before, only now it was being observed more critically by someone who had not yet decided where she belonged in the social structure of the room. Olivia's expression changed slightly as she continued to watch me, not in confusion anymore, but in evaluation, as if she was trying to understand whether the narrative she had just heard matched the reality in front of her. Then she asked again, more softly this time, what my role in the family actually was. The question landed differently than the first one. It was no longer just curiosity. It was an attempt to define context. And context, I realized, was the one thing David had been controlling throughout the entire interaction. Before I could respond, David stepped in again, trying to close the space. The question had opened. It described me in a simplified way that reduced my presence in the family to something minimal and unimportant, using language that was meant to end interpretation rather than invite it. But instead of reinforcing certainty, his explanation created the opposite effect. Olivia did not immediately accept it. Instead, she looked back at me again, this time with a level of attention that suggested she was no longer listening only to words, but also to absence, hesitation, and reaction. He could feel the room adjusting again, but this time not around what had been said, but around what was no longer stable. He realized in that moment that the situation had moved beyond a simple social exchange. It had become a comparison between narrative and observation, between what had been declared and what was actually present. And for the first time since I arrived, I understood that I was no longer only being spoken about. It was being assessed as if my identity itself was something that could be redefined depending on who chose to look more closely. The shift in the room after Olivia's second question did not produce an immediate reaction from anyone, but it created a slow redistribution of attention that was far more noticeable than any direct confrontation. He could feel it in the way people were no longer fully aligned with David's narrative, even if they had not openly rejected it. Instead of laughter or passive agreement, there was now observation, and observation changes the structure of social certainty. David seemed aware of this shift, even if he did not acknowledge it directly. His posture remained confident, but his speech began to carry a slightly more controlled rhythm, as if he was trying to regain full authority over the version of me that had already been questioned. It repeated once more that I was not involved in anything significant within the family, framing it as an obvious fact rather than an opinion, but the delivery no longer had the same effect it would have had earlier. The difference was subtle, yet important. Before Olivia's question, his words were enough to define me. Now, they only existed alongside doubt. Olivia did not interrupt him again, but she also did not accept what he was saying as conclusion. Instead, she looked at me directly, as if waiting for alignment between what she was hearing and what she was seeing. That moment placed me in a position I had not experienced before in this family context. It was no longer about defending myself or correcting a misunderstanding. It was about whether my presence would be interpreted through assumption or direct perception. I realized then that answering too quickly would not necessarily help me, because it would still allow David's framing to dictate the terms of explanation. So I chose to respond differently. I spoke calmly, without trying to counter his words directly, and instead provided only factual context about my relationship to the family structure, avoiding emotional framing or justification. That decision changed the atmosphere again, because it removed the dependency on his narrative as the primary reference point. Olivia's expression shifted slightly as she processed what I said, not because it was dramatic, but because it did not match the simplified version she had just been given. He noticed her attention move briefly toward David, then back to me, as if she was now actively comparing consistency between two competing interpretations. David appeared increasingly aware that the situation was no longer under his full control. He attempted once more to minimize the exchange, suggesting that the topic was not important and that it did not require further attention. However, this time the dismissal did not close the conversation. Instead, it highlighted the fact that he was attempting to end a line of questioning that had already begun to open. The silence that followed was different from earlier silence. It was no longer passive agreement. It was evaluation. Several guests avoided speaking, but their attention remained fixed on the interaction, indicating that the narrative was no longer being collectively reinforced in the same way. Olivia then asked a third question, this time more precise, asking how long I had actually been part of the family in terms of involvement and presence. It was not accusatory, but it was clarifying, and that distinction mattered. Because clarification implies that existing assumptions are no longer sufficient. At that moment, I understood that the conversation had moved beyond personal embarrassment or social hierarchy. It had become a breakdown in accepted narrative structure. David's version of me was no longer automatically stable. It required reinforcement, and reinforcement was beginning to fail. He could see it in the slight hesitation before he responded again, and in the way he glanced briefly at others in the room before speaking, as if checking whether support still existed without needing to be requested. It was the first time I saw uncertainty appear in him during the entire interaction. And in that uncertainty, the entire balance of the room began to shift in a way that no one was openly acknowledging yet, but everyone was now silently registering. The moment David's confidence began to falter, it did not happen in an obvious way, but through a series of small adjustments in behavior that only became visible when compared against how firmly he had been controlling the room earlier. He could see it in the way his answers became slightly more defensive, as if he was no longer simply describing me, but actively trying to maintain the structure of a description that was no longer being fully accepted. Olivia's presence was now the most important variable in the room, not because she was speaking the most, but because she was the first person who had introduced uncertainty into what had previously been treated as established truth. She did not look satisfied or unsatisfied. Instead, she looked attentive, as if she was assembling a version of events based on direct observation rather than inherited explanation. That distinction mattered more than anything else happening in the room. David attempted to reinforce his earlier framing again, repeating that I had always been distant from meaningful family involvement, but the repetition itself now felt less like authority and more like insistence. And insistence only becomes necessary when certainty is already weakening. He remained still, allowing the dynamic to continue without interruption. Because I understood that any emotional reaction from me would immediately be absorbed into his narrative as justification or dismissal. Instead, I focused on maintaining clarity in my responses whenever I was addressed, keeping them consistent and factual without allowing them to be reframed into something subjective. Olivia then shifted slightly in her position, no longer addressing David directly, but instead asking me a more specific question about the nature of my role within the family during past gatherings and decisions. The question was not aggressive, but it carried weight because it required a structural answer rather than a personal one. That shift changed the energy in the room again, because it forced everyone present to reconsider whether they had been observing a person or simply accepting a description of one. He answered in the same measured way as before, stating only what could be confirmed about my actual involvement without adopting the framing that had been imposed earlier. As I spoke, I noticed something subtle happen among the guests. Their attention no longer followed David automatically. Instead, it began to alternate between him and me, as if they were recalibrating their internal assumptions. This kind of shift does not produce immediate visible reactions, but it changes the stability of the environment itself. David sensed it as well. He attempted to redirect the conversation back to its original tone, lightly suggesting that the topic was unnecessary and that it should not be given more importance than it deserved. But the attempt to minimize it now highlighted the fact that it had already gained importance. Olivia did not respond to his attempt to close the subject. Instead, she continued to observe, and in doing so, she maintained the opening that had already been created. That silence from her was more influential than any direct statement, because it indicated that she was still processing rather than concluding. He realized then that the situation had moved into a stage where authority was no longer being held by whoever spoke the most confidently, but by whoever remained most consistent under examination. And for the first time, I saw David's certainty begin to fracture not through confrontation, but through comparison. The room had not yet reached a conclusion, but it was no longer stable in the way it had been at the beginning. Something had already shifted, and everyone present could feel it even if no one was willing to name it yet. The moment the room reached a point of unstable balance, it did not collapse into chaos, but instead entered a quieter and more dangerous phase where every participant began to measure what was being said against what was being observed. He could feel this shift most clearly in the absence of immediate reactions. No one laughed now. No one reinforced David's framing automatically. Even those who had previously remained passive were now listening with a level of attention that suggested they were recalibrating their understanding in real time. David attempted once more to stabilize the situation by returning to familiarity, speaking as if repetition alone could restore certainty. He described me again in simplified terms, but the structure of his words now lacked the same social support it had at the beginning of the gathering. What had once sounded like explanation now sounded like insistence, and insistence is always a sign that authority is no longer complete. Olivia, however, remained the most significant presence in the room, not because she spoke frequently, but because she had not yet committed to either version of reality being presented. That neutrality created space, and in that space uncertainty grew. She looked at me again, not with doubt, but with a kind of focused attention that suggested she was building her own interpretation independently of what she had been told. Then she asked a more precise question, one that shifted the conversation from identity labels to actual history. She asked about specific past interactions within the family, events that could be verified not through description but through memory and shared experience. That question changed everything, because it moved the discussion from abstract judgment into concrete reference points. He answered carefully, focusing only on what I could confirm without exaggeration. Or minimización. He described my actual presence in prior family situations, my involvement when directly included, and my absence when I had not been invited or informed. He did not attempt to frame these facts emotionally. He simply stated them. As I spoke, I noticed that several guests began to subtly adjust their posture and attention, as if they were comparing what I was saying to what they remembered. That comparison process introduced a level of internal conflict that had not been present earlier. David recognized this immediately. His responses became faster, more defensive, and less structured. He attempted to redirect attention away from specific details and back toward general impressions, but general impressions no longer held the same weight now that specifics had been introduced. Olivia did not intervene, but she also did not allow the subject to be closed. Her continued attention acted as a stabilizing force for the questioning process, ensuring that it did not collapse back into easy dismissal. He realized then that the dynamic in the room had fundamentally changed. It was no longer controlled by who spoke first or who spoke most confidently. It was now controlled by who could maintain consistency under direct examination. And in that structure, narratives that had once seemed stable began to show gaps that could not easily be repaired through repetition. David's confidence continued to erode, not through confrontation, but through the accumulation of unanswered inconsistencies that no longer went unnoticed. The room itself felt different now, not louder or more chaotic, but more careful, as if everyone present understood that the version of reality they had accepted at the beginning of the evening was no longer sufficient to explain what they were now seeing. And in that silent recalibration, I understood that the question Olivia had asked earlier was no longer just a moment of curiosity. It had become the point from which everything else in the room could no longer remain the same. The shift that had begun earlier in the room did not settle into resolution, but instead continued evolving into a more defined separation between perception and assumption. He could feel that separation most clearly in the way conversations were no longer flowing naturally around a single accepted interpretation of me. Instead, every glance, pause, and reaction now carried a sense of evaluation, as if each person in the room was quietly reprocessing what they thought they already understood. David, however, was still attempting to hold on to the structure he had built at the beginning of the evening. It continued to speak about me in simplified terms, but the confidence in his voice was no longer supported by the room in the same way it had been earlier. What once felt like shared agreement had become individual observation. Olivia remained the central point of disruption in this shift, not because she was actively challenging anyone, but because she had not accepted any single version of events as final. Instead, she continued to observe both what was being said and what was not aligning with what she was directly seeing. That distinction created a quiet but persistent instability in the social environment. At one point, she asked another question, more detailed than before, focusing on specific moments in the family history where roles and interactions had been defined. This was not a question designed to provoke emotion. It was structured to test consistency. And consistency, once examined closely, becomes either confirmation or collapse. He responded again with measured clarity, describing only what could be verified from my own experience without attempting to interpret the intentions behind how I had been treated. He noticed that as I spoke, the reactions in the room became less uniform. Some guests looked between me and David as if comparing two versions of the same timeline. Others remained still, but their silence no longer felt like passive agreement. It felt like processing. David attempted once more to regain control of the framing, but his language now revealed more effort than certainty. It tried to redirect attention away from specific details and back toward generalized characterizations, but those generalizations were no longer sufficient to override the specificity that had now entered the conversation. Olivia did not interrupt him, but she also did not allow his framing to stand unchallenged through silence. Her continued attention to me ensured that the conversation remained anchored in observation rather than narrative control. That alone changed the entire structure of the interaction. He began to understand that what was unfolding was no longer a simple disagreement about perception. It was a breakdown in narrative authority, where one version of events could no longer automatically dominate simply because it had been stated first or repeated more confidently. Instead, the room was now operating in a state where every claim required internal validation against visible behavior and remembered interaction. That shift placed David in a position where repetition no longer strengthened his argument but instead exposed its dependence on reinforcement. The more he attempted to reassert his framing, the more it became clear that it was not self-sustaining. Olivia's presence continued to function as the stabilizing variable in this new dynamic, because she was the only person who had not committed to accepting either interpretation without examination. And in that space of non-commitment, the balance of authority slowly moved away from assertion and toward evidence. He could see now that the earlier question she had asked was not an isolated moment of curiosity. It had initiated a process that was still unfolding, one that could not be easily reversed once the underlying assumptions had been interrupted. The room had not reached a conclusion, but it had already passed a point of return where the original version of me presented at the beginning of the evening could no longer remain unchallenged. The atmosphere in the room had now fully transitioned into a state where nothing could be taken at face value without being internally tested against direct observation. He could sense this not through any single dramatic action, but through the accumulation of micro-reactions that signaled a collective recalibration. Conversations had not resumed in a normal way after the previous exchanges. Instead, people were now speaking less and observing more, as if waiting to see which version of reality would stabilize. David, however, was still attempting to restore the original structure of the narrative. He spoke again about me in simplified terms, but his language now carried a visible effort to maintain coherence rather than natural confidence. Each repetition made it clearer that he was no longer reinforcing an accepted truth, but trying to preserve one that was being quietly questioned. Olivia remained the most significant influence on the direction of the room, not because she had taken a formal position, but because she had not aligned herself with any existing one. Her attention continued to move between me and David with careful consistency, as if she was measuring alignment between description and reality rather than choosing sides. At one point, she asked a follow-up question that narrowed the focus even further, asking about specific instances where my presence in family situations had been acknowledged or dismissed in front of others. The precision of the question shifted the dynamic again, because it required verification rather than interpretation. He responded by describing only what I could confirm from direct experience, avoiding emotional framing and focusing on factual consistency. As I spoke, I noticed that several people in the room began to subtly adjust their understanding in real time, no longer relying solely on David's framing but comparing it against what they could personally recall. This comparison process introduced visible hesitation into the previously stable group dynamic. David attempted once more to minimize the significance of the exchange, suggesting that it was unnecessary to overanalyze past interactions. However, this attempt no longer functioned as closure. Instead, it highlighted that the conversation was now dependent on explanation rather than assumption. Olivia did not counter him directly, but her continued focus on me prevented the discussion from collapsing back into a simplified narrative. That silence acted as a stabilizing force for inquiry rather than dismissal. He realized that what was happening was no longer a disagreement between two perspectives, but a structural shift in how truth itself was being evaluated within the room. Previously, narrative authority had been based on repetition and confidence. Now it was being tested against consistency and direct observation. In that shift, David's position became increasingly difficult to maintain without additional reinforcement, which was no longer being provided by the group in the same way. The more he attempted to reassert control over the framing, the more apparent it became that the framing itself was under review. Olivia's role in this process remained crucial because she continued to withhold premature conclusion. That withholding created space for contradiction to exist without immediate resolution, and in that space, the hierarchy of interpretation began to weaken. He could see that people were no longer simply reacting to what was being said, but actively reconsidering what they had assumed before the conversation began. The original version of me that had been presented at the start of the gathering was no longer functioning as an uncontested reference point. Instead, it had become one possibility among others, subject to comparison rather than acceptance. And in that subtle but irreversible shift, the foundation of the entire social exchange had already changed, even though no one had yet stated the conclusion aloud. The moment the conversation reached this stage, the room had fully entered a state where every participant was no longer responding to a single shared narrative, but instead holding their own internal comparison between what had been assumed and what was now being observed. He could feel this shift not as something spoken, but as something distributed across subtle changes in posture, attention, and silence. No one was fully disengaged anymore. Even those who had previously remained passive were now actively listening, as if the stability of the entire social structure depended on whether one version of me could still hold against another. David, however, was increasingly isolated in his attempt to maintain control over the original framing. His language had not changed dramatically, but its effectiveness had diminished. Each time he repeated his earlier characterization of me, it no longer anchored the room in agreement. Instead, it required justification, and justification is already a sign that certainty has weakened. Olivia remained the most structurally significant presence in the room, not because she was leading the conversation, but because she had become the reference point against which both narratives were being tested. She did not rush toward conclusion. Instead, she continued to observe patterns, inconsistencies, and alignment between description and lived presence. At one point, she asked a question that further narrowed the focus of the conversation, asking whether there had been consistent acknowledgement of my presence within family contexts over time, or whether it had fluctuated depending on situation and audience. That question shifted the entire framework again, because it removed interpretation entirely and replaced it with pattern recognition. He answered carefully, focusing only on what I had directly experienced across multiple occasions, without extending into speculation or emotional framing. As I spoke, I could see that several people in the room were no longer relying on David's statements as primary reference points. Instead, they were comparing my responses against their own memories, creating internal contradictions that could not be easily dismissed. David attempted once more to minimize the direction of the conversation, suggesting that it was unnecessary to overanalyze past interactions and that the present moment should not be redefined by reinterpretation. However, this attempt no longer functioned as closure. Instead, it highlighted the fact that reinterpretation had already begun. Olivia did not interrupt him, but she also did not allow the discussion to return to its earlier simplicity. Her continued attention ensured that the conversation remained open to evaluation rather than reduction. He realized then that what was unfolding was no longer about disagreement between individuals, but about the collapse of a single dominant narrative that had previously gone unchallenged. The authority that had once belonged to repetition and confidence was now being replaced by the need for consistency under observation. And in that transition, David's position became increasingly difficult to sustain, not because he was being directly opposed, but because the structure that had supported his version of events was no longer automatically accepted by the room. Olivia's role in this shift remained essential, because she continued to hold a position of inquiry rather than conclusion, allowing uncertainty to remain active long enough for truth to surface through comparison rather than declaration. He could see now that the original version of me that had been presented at the beginning of the evening was no longer functioning as a fixed identity within the group. It had become one interpretation among others, and in that change, the entire social balance of the room had already moved beyond the point where it could easily return to how it had been before. The final stage of the interaction did not arrive as a sudden resolution, but as a gradual stabilization of uncertainty, where the room itself seemed to settle into a new structure of understanding that no longer depended on a single dominant narrative. He could feel this shift most clearly in the way silence was no longer passive. It had become active, reflective, and deliberate. Every person in the room was now holding their own version of interpretation, but none of those versions could fully override the others anymore. David was still speaking, but the function of his words had changed. They no longer defined reality for the room. Instead, they existed alongside competing interpretations that were now equally visible. His attempts to reassert my role in simplified terms were met not with agreement, but with quiet comparison. Olivia remained the central stabilizing factor in this transformation. She did not declare conclusions or assign authority to either side. Instead, she continued to observe with consistent attention, as if ensuring that the conversation remained anchored in observable reality rather than inherited assumption. At one point, she asked a final clarifying question, not directed at emotion or perception, but at consistency over time. She asked whether the way I had been described today matched how I had actually been treated across multiple family contexts in the past. That question did not introduce new conflict. Instead, it consolidated everything that had already been exposed. He answered in a calm and measured way, confirming only what I had directly experienced without extending beyond what could be verified. As I spoke, I noticed that the reactions in the room were no longer divided into agreement or disagreement with David. Instead, they were forming a third state, which was recognition of inconsistency itself. People were no longer asking who was right in a simple sense. They were beginning to acknowledge that the narrative they had been given was incomplete in ways they had not previously considered. David attempted one final time to reframe the situation as unnecessary overanalysis, suggesting that the conversation should return to normal family interaction rather than continue examining past interpretations. But this attempt no longer carried authority. It functioned only as a reminder that control over the narrative had already weakened beyond repair. Olivia did not respond to his final attempt. Instead, she looked at me for a prolonged moment, not with surprise or judgment, but with a quiet recognition that the version of me she had been initially presented with no longer matched the version she had observed directly throughout the evening. That silent acknowledgement carried more weight than any verbal statement in the room. He realized then that the situation had fully transitioned from narrative dominance to narrative fragmentation, where no single explanation could fully contain what everyone had now seen. The original framing of me as insignificant or irrelevant no longer existed as an uncontested truth. It had become one interpretation among several, all of which now required individual validation. And in that final shift, I understood that the power in the room had not been taken through confrontation, but through exposure to inconsistency that could no longer be ignored. The gathering did not end with resolution or reconciliation. It ended with awareness, and that awareness permanently altered how every person present would now understand what had taken place long after the conversation itself had ended.